So maybe these people came as mercenaries, maybe they were part of the society, but they also did DNA analysis of these people. And this is just a kind of an analysis of kind of where the genes for these people came from. But the general, this is quite technical, but the general feeling, this is kind of like a heat map, is that these people came probably ancestrally, they're from Northern Africa, but not necessarily their immediate ancestors. So that's kind of quite interesting.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Talk Podcast. We're hyped and honored to have one of the leading archaeologists in the field of Islamic archaeology, Professor Andrew Petersen, joining us today. And he's here to take us on a deep dive into the fascinating world of Muslim burial archaeology. Thanks for being here, Professor Petersen. Roxana and I are extremely excited to hear about the historical insights that burial sites provide on early Muslim communities and Islamic history more broadly. So yeah, let's dig in. So our first question, why do archaeologists consider burial sites so essential for understanding past civilizations? What make these places unique sources of information or knowledge?
Okay, well, yeah, thanks. That's good. Yeah, I mean, I think most people, when they hear about archaeology, they often think about burials. When you think about maybe like as maybe royal tombs, things like that, or you think about maybe even early humans, very early humans. You think about Neolithic things. A lot of the evidence that people are interested in, because really fundamentally archaeology is a study of humanity. I'd say it's a study of humanity in the past, and really the best evidence is the people themselves, the physical remains. I mean, because everything else we have, say like cups or anything like that, broken pottery, which archaeologists use a lot, that's fine, but that's all like associated with humans. But the actual human remains are quite very important. And really, I suppose over the years, archaeologists have got better and better at identifying human remains and analyzing them to gain an insight into kind of past humanity. And one other thing I think is worth saying is that I've come to this view more and more about archaeology in general. Actually, is that I think in a good way of thinking about archaeology, is maybe less romantic than some people have, but I think in a way archaeology is like a bit like forensics. It's about using physical evidence to establish the truth or the facts about the past. I mean, some people say archaeology is all based on your own opinion and it's your own point of view and things like that. And there is a school of archaeology which says everything, whatever you say, has some kind of bias in it from your own thinking. But I'd say at the heart, archaeology must really be about trying to establish certain facts. It might not tell you everything. And one of the interesting things, in fact, one of the very uninteresting things about archaeology is that often you can find out some information, but it really doesn't tell you the whole story. It just tells you a little bit. But the good thing about archaeology is what it does tell you, and this is what we present as data in our reports. What it does tell you, is pretty good because it's usually based on actual physical evidence. And that evidence is usually pretty reliable. Occasionally there are mistakes, but generally, so what you can say with a high degree of certainty. But the disappointing thing is it often leaves loads of questions, but cumulatively it builds towards a better understanding of the past. Well, just I don't know if you're gonna mention this, but I'll bring it up anyway.
Sure.
Just I think this might be helpful, or well, just useful. Is I've got here a sheet which you can see, and this is what we call a burial sheet, and this is what our archaeologists actually use when they're digging up Muslim burials. So what you have here is you have a skeleton, a diagram of a standard skeleton, and then with small bits for the arms and all the little bits. So when you're excavating a skeleton or a grave, you can mark on these all the bits that are present and all those that are not present. And here we've got an example. Unfortunately, the site, this is from a pre-Islamic burial from Iraqi Kurdistan. Unfortunately, it rained during the, and so the thing's a bit wet and doesn't look so good. But here you can see what we've actually done. So here we've highlighted all the bones that are present. So this is from a burial that's about 2,700 years old.
So my question is, there something similar like with epigraphic evidence or data that is found? A database where this is stored and where, say, the average person has access to, or maybe in short, is there any kind of database that contains all of the knowledge of the not just Islamic burial sites, but burial sites more in general?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, that's a good question. And I'd say, I think because and this is a thing that's worth saying, actually. Yeah, it's definitely worth saying, because the number of burials, archaeological excavations of burials, is vast. It really is vast, and it's much bigger than most people are aware of, because and this happens also in Muslim countries. It's worth stressing that. But when there's any development, if you think of how many people have ever lived, it's a lot of people, and most of those people have lived more recently rather than in the distant past. So the number of humans on the earth is only increasing. So what it means is, from historical periods, say from the last 1,000 years, there are tens, hundreds of thousands of burials. And so the cemeteries that these occupy get bigger and bigger, and sometimes they forget, well, quite often they get forgotten about. But when you have any development, the expansion of cities, they often have to build on old burial grounds. And so you often get, in the past, it was just clearance operations where they simply just removed the cemetery, the graves, without recording any evidence. But more recently, it's become more and more of a specialist archaeological procedure. And so, for example, with the HS2 project in Britain, which was to build a high-speed rail link to Manchester, to Birmingham, yeah. During that process, there were lots and lots of archaeological investigations, but also huge numbers of burials excavated. Some of those were ancient, medieval, but also some of them were quite modern. And so there are lots and lots of burials excavated, thousands. And these are being studied, but really, and there's a lot of cooperation between different forensic, between different osteoarchaeologists. These are the people who study these things mostly. But there's no comprehensive global database, although that would be a good idea. But I'll mention it a bit later on. I think when you come to DNA analysis, then we may be getting towards something like that. But that's a little bit rarer at the moment.
What you were saying about how a lot of these burial sites, they, people stumble across them. It makes sense considering what I was reading in the papers you shared with me.
Yeah.
A lot of the Muslim burials that were found by accident. And because I was wondering, like, how do people go about like excavating Muslim burial sites? Do they just go and say, okay, there's a Muslim burial site over there, and let's go see what's underneath the ground? But a lot of it is happenstance, which I found extremely interesting. And not only that they would find one or two graves, unlike examples or the case studies that we'll speak about later.
Yeah.
They find hundreds, if not several hundreds of graves in one location, and sometimes from different periods. So yeah, I found that extremely interesting. And for those who, if they didn't get an idea already, for those who picture mummies and royal tombs when thinking of burial sites, as you have already mentioned, How is studying early Islamic burials different, and what unique insights do they offer?
Okay, that's good question. Okay, how are they different? Well, first of all, I'd say, and I'll kind of show an example later on. First of all, I'd say that they differ, but burials from different cultures, let's say Roman and ancient Greek, Egyptian, there's a lot of variation in burial types in all societies, and so which are Muslim burials are distinctive, and I'll come on to why they're distinctive. But Muslim burials are quite distinctive, and but to take up the specific point of like how they might be related to, like, say, royal burials in that people maybe know about more, is as far as I'm aware, and actually the other thing I should say is another slight limitation is what we know about Muslim burials is quite limited compared with other periods and other cultures. So we don't know. But as far as I'm aware, no, there are no real Muslim burials that are they tend not to be buried with grave goods, and they tend not to have like big monument. They may have big tombs, but the actual burials are usually very simple, which I'll come to. So, and that's one of the kind of the ways in which they're very different in general. I mean, there's always exception, but yeah.
What do you think are the more surprising things that we can learn from studying old graves and burial customs, especially in Islamic context? What can we learn about really the people who these burial contexts represent?
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, what could we learn about the people? Okay. Well, so again, this applies to all kind of burial archaeology, but I think, well, and this comes back to the nature of archaeology as well, is that what archaeology does is it gives you information which people don't necessarily write down. So you wouldn't necessarily have written records about. We know a certain amount historically from what people said about burials, about when somebody dies and they buried so and so, and they do. And we know certain amount about burial traditions, particularly from Egypt, where they're written down what happens. But really, a lot of this isn't written down. So you can tell a little bit about kind of the actual process of how people were buried, how deep, and things like that, sort of basic things, and the type of grave. But then actually from we don't have grave goods in general, and that's a thing. So we don't find out much from that. There's occasionally one or two things, but we don't find out much from grave goods. And in general, there aren't coffins. There may be shrouds. But what we can find out a lot from is the actual body itself. And this and this is a useful thing to say. A lot of this depends on how much actually survives, because and what survives, and this is a general thing for human burials, what survives in the soil depends a lot on the type of the soil, what you're buried in. So acidic soils, and so in Wales, there's a lot of, where I am at the moment, there's a lot of acidic soils. So human remains tend to decay quite quickly. And for example, a very long time ago, I excavated a site quite near to where I live for a development. And there was two early Christian burials, early for here. So that's about the same time as early Islam, actually, about 8th century graves. But the graves were there, and they're just very, very, very tiny traces of bones. I mean, really hardly there at all. And so when we tried to actually collect them, there's actually nothing to collect. So in acidic soils, things, then the only information you can get generally is just the shape of the grave. But if you actually get the body surviving, you can tell from the way the body is laid out, how it's, because sometimes they're crouched, sometimes they're extended. So the position of the body, that's kind of very basic. And then as I say, the people who study human bones in archaeology, they're generally called, well, the people who mostly study are called osteoarchaeologists, and this is a big field within archaeology, which means looking at the human bones. And they can tell, okay, so you've got first of all, you see how many bones are present. Some may have decayed, some may have been missing from the start, like somebody could have had their hand chopped off, for example. So these are the sort of things we begin to find out. And you get paleopathology, which is looking at the diseases that people may have had. So you may have, for example, some, not all, but many diseases, and certainly things that kill people. You can see signs of this on the bones. Mm. So you can work out that somebody's had maybe leprosy or various diseases, or they've been attacked. So there's a lot you can tell about how somebody died and maybe how they lived, just from the actual appearance of the bones themselves. And of course,
that would be distinguishable from, say, if an animal got to the bones first, or if they were disturbed even by human activity.
Good question. And the animal thing is an animal disturbance is a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing to talk about. Okay, sometimes we get on bones, we get traces of gnawing from maybe a rat or a rodent. Or we get, or maybe I say I'm not a specialist osteoarchaeologist, but osteoarchaeologists, and I've seen this, you can actually see the traces of, I mean, archaeologists are very good at identifying how bones have been, whether they've been bitten, eaten by an animal, or attacked by an animal, or by some other process. And they can even tell, and there's complex reasons why they can do this, but you can even tell whether the deformation, say a broken bone, you can tell whether this happened before somebody died, a long time before they died, just after they died, or a long time after they died. So there's indications of all these types of things. So you can kind of distinguish between when the cause of these things, and archaeologists in general, because I think what will help to understand why they're very good at this is because they also work on very, very ancient human remains, where we're talking about the understanding of human origins. And so the techniques developed for those can also be applied to later burials, which includes Islamic burials. So it's really a highly developed science. And just looking at human burials, there's like loads of different specialists. So I say there's osteoarchaeologists who look at the bones, and then there's people who look at the DNA, and then there's people who look at the diseases, and then there's people who look at diet. So there's so many different specialists that can be involved. And so, yeah, to continue answering the question about what you can find, I'd sort of drifted from that. What you can find from human remains is, so all of those things you can find just by visual examination, maybe sometimes with a microscope. And then the next stage is analysis of actual material. So if you've got actually bits of bones which you can take, then you can do things like you can find out if they had a mineral deficiency. So maybe somebody wasn't eating enough something, or they had, so you can tell from an analysis deficiencies, calcium deficiency, things like that. And also a big thing, which is interesting, is often it's to do with people's teeth. People's teeth often has a problem. And then we go further, and you can go further into this, is then you can do isotope analysis, which is where you can work out where somebody lived when they grew up, and also if they're an adult, where they lived more recently. And that depends, and I'll give you an example in the thing, but so that depends on the type of area that you're living and the type of vegetation there. So for example, some places and this is connected with the underlying geology where you grow plants. So the plants will absorb some of the underlying geology, or only certain plants will grow in certain areas, and people eat these. So you'll, in general, tend to get more of one type of mineral than another, and that kind of tells you where that kind of work. From that, you can work out where somebody grew up, and then where they lived later on. So that's isotope analysis. And then another thing is the I mean, there are some other forms of analysis which I won't go into at the moment. But then the big one now is the ancient DNA analysis, which is where you actually look at somebody's genetic makeup. And that has opened up a whole new field. And so what I like to say, well, what I've realized is you can now find out from a person, if you have a skeleton in a grave, you can actually find out more about this person than they may have known themselves about themselves, which is quite amazing.
Yeah, I was surprised on the aDNA analysis that they
Yes.
did on the findings in Nimes, France, and how
Yes, yeah.
they were not only able to tell that they were North African, but that they had ancient North Africa, or at least North
Yes.
African DNA that predated the Islamic conquest in that region. So
Yes.
yeah, I found that to be extremely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is kind of really, because it's this genetic component to who we are, and then identifying that, and then I think, yeah, and then so that's this is a pun now, it's unintentional, but that's kind of the skeleton of the information, and based on that, you can, as an archaeologist, you can, the type that I am, which is kind of more dealing with a culture and a period, you can draw in the different aspects of scientific evidence from the specialists, and you can kind of construct your best guess about sort of what happened, how this person got there, who they were, and things like that. So it's
Genetic history, so to speak.
yeah, and it's and I suppose again, the thing to stress, and I think it's a good thing about archaeology, is that it's very collaborative. So it's not just, it involves a lot of people, a lot of specialists, and a lot of communication and checking. And so yeah, that's probably worth saying. Yeah.
And how frequently are Islamic burial sites actually studied in archaeology? Sort of what and particularly like what challenges do researchers face due to things like religious sensitivities and political contexts?
Okay, yeah, good. That's something that is a big challenge, and I'd say in general, they're not studied very much. They have been studied. I can show you a table. There have been occasions, but compared with, let's say, populations, I mean, Christian or whatever, some may be Muslim, but populations in Britain and France and Europe, not very much. And that's for a few reasons. One is I think one is to do with the development of archaeology. So I'd say that within Europe and the US, maybe, and because there's some special issues in the US as well, but in general, I suppose it's to do with development. Europe's quite crowded, and also archaeology is quite a developed discipline in Europe. And so there've been lots and lots of studies of archaeological human remains within Europe. And actually, that is where we get kind of, if you're looking at it kind of a Venn diagram, that is where Spain comes in, because Spain is a European country, yet it had in the past a big, significant, huge Muslim population, and so there the majority of Muslim burials that have been excavated and studied in a lot of detail from Spain. I mean, it's tens of thousands. Maybe I can't even keep up on the number, but huge numbers. So, but that's kind of only in Spain. But the restrictions really, and they kind of vary from country to country, are to do with well, ironically, I think part of this is kind of not, I was going to say a long story, but an interesting story. I'll try and keep it short. But okay, amongst Jews, particularly, well, actually, amongst most people, most cultures, actually, there is a slight antipathy or reticence, let's say, about digging up human remains, and that's a natural thing and probably a good thing. That's not done just randomly, but within and also in pre-modern society, and this is Christians, Jews, Muslims, and probably others. There's an idea that that when you died, your physical body, and this is if you believe in an afterlife, your physical body, the actual same physical body was needed. So there's the idea, and we get this, I suppose, in Halloween, this idea of zombies. You actually physically resurrected from the dead, and so the dead actually need all their things intact. So that's kind of one element of the reticence which exists in Muslim societies is kind of there. And then another thing which is interesting, and Jews, particularly Orthodox Jews, and particularly Orthodox Jews and some branches of Orthodox Jews, they're very, very hot on this. It's very, very important to them. So let's say in the 1970s, 1980s, it became a big issue within Israel or within Palestine. It became a big issue that any archaeologists were cursed, actually. There's a curse placed on all archaeologists working in what they described as Eretz Israel because of the idea of they're excavating remains. And the presumption was, if we don't know who these people were, we must presume that somehow they are Jewish, whether they're not. So you have to prove, and if they were, then they should be treated properly, and you can't excavate them, you can't disturb them. And so then this got extended into a blanket ban on all excavations of human remains there. And just another side element in this, what also strengthened this idea is also coming from the United States, where I think the excavation of Native American or First Nation, whatever, in the US, that had caused a lot of trouble because archaeologists there were excavating lots of sites which were considered maybe sacred, and they weren't given the due reverence. And then, so I suppose, and also this has also happened in Australia. So all these things kind of feed in to this idea of reticence to excavate human burials. And then more recently, I'd say in terms of Islamic burials in particular, I think there's been there's that reticence from those three sources, plus an additional one, which I suppose is this strong traditions about keeping the body intact, and also about who is, let's say, qualified to excavate a Muslim burial. Now, I'm not an expert on the Islamic texts about this, but I've looked enough to know that there may be some prohibitions, but most of these are kind of derived from traditions. And the majority of information that I've been able to get about Muslim burials is most of the things that are done aren't necessarily written down. So there's a strong tradition, oral tradition. Sometimes it's written down, but it's not necessarily directly part of the canonical religion, but it's kind of there within the traditions of let's say Middle Eastern societies, that you don't kind of touch the burial. So, and that's been a big restriction. So, and then I just say one other thing. There's a perception, and I don't know. There's a perception that the only people that, if you do remove human burials, and let's say you need to build a hospital, or let's say something even more important than that, I don't know, but if you for some reason you need to move Muslim burials, then it should be done by Muslims, and preferably by people religiously instructed, and they should be moved to another burial site. Having said that, I just need to add one more thing, and this applies to Britain as well, is for those reasons I was saying earlier, like there's become, I think since, let's say, the 1960s, there's developed much more reverence for human remains than there used to be, let's say, in the 1960s when people were digging them up. So in the 1960s in Britain and other places, people would just be dug up and moved. This is maybe not, but nowadays, even with the archaeological study, they get stored in warehouses, they get kept separately, and they're studied. And then at the end of all this, they're buried in a fitting way, with some form of, not if they're religious, with a religious ceremony, if you don't know, without that, but with due reverence. And just one other thing that I'll say that is useful to know. In Britain, and I think to a certain extent in most countries, when you're actually excavating a burial, there's an idea that, well, no, in Britain it's the law that you actually can't have the grave exposed to the general public. So they must be screened from the general public. So you can't have people casually looking into a grave. It's only those who are. And so that's quite an important thing, and you need a license. So a long time ago, I excavated a cemetery in Britain, and you have to get a license from the Home Secretary, and you have to screen the site, and you have to be very, very respectful. But so in general, across the world, there's been a feeling that when you're doing these excavations, you get as much information as you can, but you also treat the people with respect. Oh yeah, and just one little thing is, I was told early on that you never, when there's maybe a temptation, if you've got lots of skeletons around as you're excavating, to maybe give them names and stuff, even though you know. But I was told very early on, when I was a student in archaeology, you should never do that, because you should give them the respect. You don't know what their names was, and you should always even speak of them with respect. So that's another issue. Yeah. So those are some of the constraints.
And you mentioned something that was very interesting, that a lot of the Muslim burial practices are traditional, not canonical. And when we were looking into it, you know, the Quran doesn't specify really any burial rituals for Muslims, yet Muslims worldwide follow remarkably similar practices. Do we have any idea how these rituals developed historically outside of what we find in Muslim traditions? And what can early burial sites tell us about the evolution of how Muslim burials evolved?
Okay, good. Yeah, that's very important aspect to consider. That's a very interesting question. So yeah, yeah, I mean that to me is the thing that is most kind of interesting and most significant, I'd say, particularly when we're looking at early Muslim burials, just the uniformity of practice over a big area. So I might mention this in the key study, but we have, for example, from Ethiopia, which is in sort of East Africa, quite a long way down, from Ethiopia to southern France to Syria, very early on, let's say possibly, you know, 7th century, within a few years of the beginnings of Islam as a religion, we get remarkably similar. People are laid out, and they're buried in very, very similar manner over a huge area within a very short space of time. In a way that wasn't the same. And the other thing is the way that is distinctive and is different from the previous traditions in those areas. So something, and what's interesting, even when you go, I mean, I suppose in Arabia itself, let's say around, you know, the Hijaz region, we don't really know too much. We know about very pre-Islamic burials, but we don't really know that much about how people were being buried, say, just before Islam. But it's just very interesting that very early on you get this, as soon as you get Muslim burials and you know they're Muslim, you get this very distinctive form. Now, was this a form that came from pre-Islamic Arabia? Probably not. So it's interesting. Why did everybody? How did this process, this way of burying people, get spread? How did it get spread? And I suppose, in a sense, why did it not get written down? It did. Some of it did get written down, but it's much later. And I think most of the evidence is from Egypt, and it was kind of. It's just very interesting that you get this, and given that I mean, people often say this about burial and death, is that it's obviously it's important for people, but it's really important for society, because it says, you know, who the society is, and it's a one time in a human's life where you're really making a statement about, I suppose, culture, what you belong to culturally. It's a very fundamental statement, and the fact that this is adopted very early on is, I think, really interesting, and it's why I think really a lot more work needs to be done on this, because I think it's remarkable. Actually, I think it's remarkable, and it's probably a good research project. Maybe would be to look at how this compares with early Christian burials, how they transformed from, let's say, pagan to early Christian. But from what I've read and looked at, that's kind of much more diverse, the types of burials that Christians underwent early on. And so with Islam, it seems very, very definite that a certain method of burial was adopted. And I think, yeah, more work would be very interesting research to do.
And you mentioned that you had slides to kind of give examples of how or what, you know, kind of Muslim burials look like. I know Roxana and I, we have a pretty good idea, because we've been looking at pictures trying to put together this podcast.
Yeah.
If you had anything to slide to show before Roxana goes and asks her next question, that'll be.
Okay, that's good. I'll just give a quick, I'll just go through it quite quickly, but this part presentation, just to really show you, just to give you some pictures now. So I need to get, and then, okay. So this is, I'm just using a presentation which I used earlier, but this is just a little, just some examples. So these are, just to, I suppose what I wanted to show here is obviously burials, a very early thing that humans started doing. I think some of the earliest one of the earliest burials is from Shanadar cave in Iraq, which is Neanderthal. But burial seems to be, in other words, disposal of humans who've died in a way that's appropriate, and keeps them somehow kind of sacred or not disturbed. And that's why I was interested when you asked about the animals earlier on. I think one of the things that's seems to be a big thing in historical burials is really the need to protect a deceased person from being dug up by animals and kind of eaten, because that's obviously obviously not good, and obviously it's it's very bad. And so and you get this in all societies. These are just some examples from Jebel Hafit in the United Arab Emirates, showing some Bronze Age tombs. And here they've got these domes, and they obviously look quite good. And the idea is this is like a place where people are buried. And one of the other things about human burial is you also need to mark these places so they can't be disturbed in the future. That's in general the idea. And so these types of tombs would have been probably often multiple burials, possibly family tombs. This is again quite close by. This is again in the Al Ain district in the Arab Emirates. So this is what's called a tomb, and you can see the carving on the outside, a very elaborate. And again, this idea of you give respect to the dead, and you create monuments to them, and it's partly for protection, but partly to kind of identify who they were, and also to honor them, I suppose. And so you can see this is 4,000 years old, very nice carving. And this team, but with inside, when you go inside this circular tomb, there was human remains. And I think that's estimated. This is being excavated by a French team. And here there's the remains of about 300 people. So this is a collective burial. So in other words, you put people together in an area, and you knew that that was protected from animals digging them up, and also from humans desecrating them. So it's kind of it's possible in here because of the way that the bones are distributed, but they were there's a few grave goods in there, but that these were redeposited from somewhere else. We don't quite know exactly the process. So Islamic burials, I'd say, so Islamic burials that must have been dug up in the past, and somewhere there are some examples historically, but the first scientifically excavated Islamic burials is probably that we know about. So scientific, I suppose, means documented in any case. So one of the first is from the monument of Qubbat as-Sulabiyya in Samarra, which is the Abbasid Caliph city from the 9th century, 800s AD. And within this huge city, there's one monument called Qubbat as-Sulabiyya, the Dome of the Sulabiyya. And within this, there's a burial. So I don't know if I can make it bigger, but you can just see in there, there's a sketch of a burial. And so this site was, this monument was excavated by a German archaeologist called Herzfeld. He's a very famous archaeologist, very important for the study of Islamic culture and archaeology, architecture. And
one of the first, or was there somebody who predated him? I can't remember from one of the publications that you gave.
Yeah, I'd say he's one of the first people to really describe himself as an Islamic archaeologist. Somebody studied Islamic remains. I mean, there were people who did excavations a little bit before, but they're a bit more like treasure hunters. They were simply going after things which they could sell or nice things to keep, but they weren't so much interested in understanding. Whereas Herzfeld really was very interested in understanding the origins of Islamic art, architecture, and culture. So yeah, so he excavated this site, and then inside, and this is the only evidence, he mentions it in his notebooks, and this is actually from one of his notebooks. And here he shows pictures of what remains of the individuals. So it shows precisely where they are. The top part of that picture shows where they were in section when you're digging down. So that's if you're looking at from the side. And then the lower part of the picture shows them from above, shows the three graves. And there's also photographs. I haven't got those at the moment, but So that was this first sort of scientific excavation. And then also going on a bit later in the 1930s, we get the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, looking at some Muslim tombs from Fustat during some development. And here they were studying the graves, and here's one of the humans within the grave, so wrapped in a kind of a blanket made of fiber, plant fiber, and then with cotton underneath. I suppose the thing to say here is the Museum of Islamic Art was interested mostly in studying the textiles associated with these bodies rather than the bodies themselves, partly because I'd say even within Egyptology and other things which routinely looked at burials, the idea of medically examining the bodies hadn't really become established anywhere within archaeology. But that's kind of a example. And then I just mentioned this briefly. So what's the first one of the first examples of a Muslim cemetery? Oh yeah, because I should say at this point, there's different ways of looking at Muslim burials. Requires lots of specialists. There's the human bones, but then there's also the archaeological aspect, which is how the grave is cut in. And then there's also how you actually mark the graves. And so this is one of the earliest Muslim cemeteries. It is a place in Jordan called Castel, and it's next to an Umayyad palace. And here you get these rectangular things here. These are the graves. And here's some of the gravestones, and here's an example. So these are some of the first ever Islamic tombstones from Castel. And so that's kind of another aspect of looking at graves. And this is from some excavations at Ramla near Tel Aviv, where there've also been extensive development and the discovery of lots of human graves. And I just this is kind of what you'd see and so I suppose just to show you what a human Islamic burial might look like. I suppose the one on the left you can see best, because the one on the right there seems to be some kind of problem with the excavation, but the one on the left is an example of a grave. So the human, the person is lying on their sides, and I suppose.
And you might have mentioned this already, but do Islamic graves contain personal objects that tell us about the lives of those buried? I mean, have you come across any that have? And if not, if generally you find any, what can we infer from the simplicity or lack of grave goods?
Yeah, okay, so two things. Yeah, one, occasionally you do get things, occasionally, but it may only be very, very rarely, rarely. And if they are there may be personal adornments. I think after this presentation, I'll mention, although recently I was working in from some work in Mosul, we did find a few objects in the grave, but that in general that you don't get objects, you don't get grave goods, and you don't generally get coffins. And so the simplicity, I think, is part of the idea that I'd say it's something to do with very much to do with the religion and to do with the concept of simplicity within the religion and a direct human relationship with God, I'd say, and also the idea that everybody's equal in a certain way. So there's a lot in that, I'd say. There's a lot in that, and I think
Hello? Yeah, I'm sorry. In general, grave goods, what do they indicate as in terms of a belief system? What does their presence indicate?
Okay, good. Well, when I said earlier on that people are often when they're people in the past generally throughout the world thought that to come back to life, if you believe in an afterlife, you need your full body. So let's say with the Egyptians, for example, the idea was, in their big tombs, that they needed all of their things with them. So they need something to eat, they'd have food, they'd need servants, so servants or slaves were killed and put in the tombs with them. So it's really about, you've got a life after this. You're dead at the moment, but at some time things are going to get better, and you're going to have all of these things, and that you get that in quite a few kind of societies. So yeah, the grave goods is for your life afterwards, and then there's this idea of which I think you get in a lot of cultures. You get sometimes money to pay to get across, in the Greek tradition, get across the river Styx. You'll have to pay for the ferryman. That's a famous idea. So there's this idea of it's about that physical resurrection of the actual kind of body. So I'd say, and this is actually, that's a good point actually, when thinking about these burials, the fact that they don't have the grave goods, I'd say, maybe suggests that actually during the burial process in most Muslim traditions, the idea is that you won't need anything. In the belief is maybe that is it for you as a physical body. So there is no, and by placing grave goods, it kind of implies that there might be. So we're actually saying, actually, we don't believe that the body itself, we believe this body is kind of finished with in terms of the human spirit, and the spirit goes elsewhere. So that's an interesting, that is an interesting thing to think about. I mean, we don't know for sure, but definitely the vast majority of Muslim graves do not have any grave goods, and even probably coffins. I mean, occasionally they're used, but yeah.
But did pre-Islamic graves in the region have a degree of grave goods? Was that common?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was common, reasonably common. Different.
Would not indicate a belief in the afterlife?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing that I haven't mentioned yet, which really throws a spanner in the makes the whole thing complicated, is the question of cremation and cremation urns. Because of course some societies say and some societies immediately pre-Islamic cremated people. And so that is presumably that's presumably like a different idea of the importance of the actual body. I mean, I know Zoroastrians they had this defleshing. So I think some societies had grave goods, and they kind of wanted but in immediately pre-Islamic times, I suppose it depends where you're going. For say like in Palestine, for example, immediately pre-Islamic would have been Christian, whereas in some places it would have been pagan or whatever. So I'd say there's a huge variation in kind of what went before. But what is interesting is that, okay, I suppose, I think probably if you did have some form of burial rather than cremation, you'd often have something buried with the person. But remember, that could also be, you might be for the actual person to resurrect and live into the future, but it may also be because so that they could for the relatives or friends or the people who are upset about this person dying, it could also be them actually just throwing in one of their personal items into the grave, simply to say, well, this rests with them. I mean, it's like a mark of respect or affection or something like that. So, and I think that's also, I mentioned this, that's another kind of angle for studying burials in general, but also Muslim burials, is like kind of the anthropological approach. And I think often the anthropological approach, which is looking at like how human cultures sort of deal with this, is like how burials figure within the society, within the culture that they're from, and how people sometimes want to do things not necessarily for the deceased who's deceased, but also for their own kind of cultural purposes. There was a very I mentioned it in some of these articles, but there's a famous Swedish anthropologist called Hilda Granqvist, and she did one of the most detailed anthropological studies of death and funeral customs in a Muslim village, and that was near Bethlehem, Artas in Palestine, and she studied that. And so yeah, there's also that idea of how the present the society of which they're part, how the burial fits into their kind of belief, their customs. Yeah.
In terms of talking about burial practices
Yes.
in general, how consistent are the burial practices that we see in Muslim grave sites? Are they consistent across different sects, different regions? Do we see any notable developments over time?
Yeah, okay, good. So we over time, interestingly, no. I mean, there's an as with the geographical uniformity, I mean, there are exceptions, but as with the geographical uniformity, there's also a remarkable chronological uniformity that Muslim burials today are very similar to those very early ones. So yeah, that's and I think that says something. It says something about strong cultural religious identity and set of practices, which is spread through a huge area over a long time. So that is quite remarkable, actually. Yeah, that is one thing. Now I'll mention, yeah, I will mention this because we were talking about grave goods as well, and also because it's quite interesting. And last year I was involved in a project in Mosul where we're looking at a mosque which is being conserved, rebuilt, because it had been destroyed by during the reoccupation, due to the retaking of Mosul. And significantly, the ISIS had tried very hard, Daesh had tried very hard. They were not in favor of having human burials near mosques because of the assumption that this is kind of something they're against anyway. And so they had this, so they actually searched really hard to find human burials, but they didn't find them because they weren't proper archaeologists. But when we did to do the conservation work on the mosque, it had to be basically, a lot of it had to be rebuilt, a new floor, etc. And during that process, we found a number of Muslim burials, and within them, one of the burials, which I'm not sure of the date, but let's say it's I don't know the date, but let's say 16th century, maybe 15th, maybe 14th, so late medieval, maybe something like that. We did find we found what looked like a gaming piece, and we also found a round like stamp with inscriptions on them. They appear to be Shia, and the problem is the script's quite difficult to read, and I haven't managed to get anybody to look at them yet. But these were placed within the grave. so that's just one. But I think, as far as I know, that's unique. I haven't seen it or come across it anywhere else. So, yeah. So in general, no grave goods and remarkable uniformity. And also, one thing I should say, because for people not familiar with this, is that, and I think people who people who maybe know a little bit about Islam, Muslims, would say, well, Muslim burials, they'll be pointing in the direction of Mecca, which is true in a sense, but for people who aren't really aware, it's the head, it's the face is turned to face Mecca rather than it's not your feet or your head. It's actually the way you're looking is aligned to face Mecca, and of course, because in pre-modern times, the way of identifying the direction of Mecca was difficult. It was difficult to identify the direction of Mecca. You'll find, just as the orientation of mosques differs quite a lot, people aren't quite sure which is the direction of Mecca. Also, you'll find some of the graves, they're within a single cemetery, there'll be different interpretations of the direction towards Mecca. So, but the body, if the face is turned to Mecca, then the body will generally, because of that, the body is aligned perpendicular, so sort of like that, to the direction of Mecca. So their face, they can actually face Mecca. So yeah, that's a basic thing, and that's a telltale thing to identify people as Muslims. So yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is that you're suggesting that there is this sort of remarkable similarity both across time and place and custom in burial practices for Muslims, but the Quran doesn't specify burial rituals really at all.
No,
so
no.
How did this uniformity develop historically? What can early burial sites tell us in terms of how this uniformity was established?
Well, first, I'd say we have enough data to say that it was widespread and that it's carried on very similar, but the origins, we don't have quite enough data, so we haven't excavated enough early Muslim burials. That's kind of one thing. But also, even if we did and we just kept on getting the same information, we'd still have this kind of problem, was, well, how did people kind of, how did a group of people, say in Syria or in Ethiopia, know that this was what to do? I'd say I'd say that there must have been, and this is okay, so we've got archaeology and we've got what's written down. There must have been another thing, this very strong oral tradition where people knew what to do, which was kind of passed on. So yeah, it's interesting. So there's a very strong, this is I can't, this is my only explanation for it. There must be a very strong oral tradition within those very early Muslim societies that this is kind of what you did. I mean, I think probably what would be quite good, probably what might help, is to look at immediately some burials that are pre-Islamic from Arabia that immediately predate this, some maybe Bedouin burials. But the problem is, I don't think we have these. We do have some burials from, let's say, the Arabia region, which might include Jordan, but these are maybe either Christians or whatever, but we don't have the people who maybe were the ones who kind of converted to Islam. And then, so yeah, it's a lack of data, but it's my guess is that maybe this is maybe the simplicity idea, which we were talking about earlier. Maybe the simplicity idea is something maybe related to Bedou, because of the simply because of the idea that, and I think you get this in maybe in some of the pre-Islamic poetry that is later transmitted, is maybe there is this kind of this ideal of simplicity was kind of was like one element of, let's say, Bedouin society, which is kind of transferred. So you've got the religion, which again later it can acquire all sorts of things, but maybe this is the simplicity of that, and that's my hunch. But I think we need more evidence for that.
And do we have any differences between the way men and women are buried? I know we talked about geographically, if there were any differences across regions, but between men and women, do you see a consistent way in which both sects were buried in the same way, or do we see a difference of some sort?
Yeah, good question. In fact, what I'll do is I'll just quickly flip through some slides to get to Tel Karasa. And oh no, sorry, I can't. Anyway, this is just one of them from Tel Karasa in Syria. But there we had a male and a female burial side by side, perhaps related, maybe cousins, but not brother and sister. But the interesting thing about those, yeah, there is no difference that I can detect. I mean, there was a famous excavation at a site in the Negev called Tel El Hesi, and also in northern Iraq they had some excavations like this where they found, and the anthropologist I mentioned, Hilda Granquist, she refers to this. Sometimes women's jewelry may go into the grave with the woman, may do, but not huge amounts, not huge amounts. And I'd say the amounts that have been found in graves are kind of like incidental, in the sense that, well, they decided not to remove them, something like that. Really not. So it's not as kind of like, this is you get arrayed in a magnificent Tutankhamun mask or something like that. You don't have that. It's just simply they're not really, not everything is kind of removed. But just to do with that as well, it's worth saying that they did have shrouds, however. So a shroud, and this is again possibly, well, it is an interesting thing about Muslim society, is the idea of a shroud. Now, again, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because a shroud like made of textile can kind of disappear. Will generally disappear over time. Sometimes you find evidence of it, but you can actually tell from the way somebody's kind of buried. You can actually tell. You can tell if somebody was buried within a shroud. So a shroud is like a sleeping bag, essentially, and you can tell. You can tell. I mean, I can't, but people who work on this more, you can actually tell if somebody was kind of in a shroud and the shroud has disappeared. And from what I understand, most and not all, most early burials, Muslim burials, had shrouds, and later ones. And so again, this, I think, going back to an unwritten thing, I think this says something about Islamic societies and their relationship. I think there's a strong relationship, again, to do with trade and textiles, that textiles were kind of always kind of quite a highly valued thing within Islamic society. And so this is, yeah, this is just a thing that was considered necessary, I think. And but again, there have been some shrouds that have survived, like those ones I showed you from Egypt. And they're always very plain, unadorned. And again, this goes with the simplicity, the idea of the simple burial. Like you generally don't have luxurious textiles buried with the person.
So one of the interesting things about this site in Syria, Tel Karasa, is that it features not only the two Islamic burials that you've mentioned, but it also features a Neolithic burial site. So what, or do we find any differences between the Neolithic burials and the Islamic burials at Tel Karasa? Do these changes, or if there are changes, do they reflect the blending of pre-Islamic traditions with new religious beliefs? Because it's very interesting that these two individuals will be buried there at Tel Karasa. It doesn't seem like there was a cemetery, an Islamic cemetery present at the time. Were they buried
Yeah.
in a way of, from what archaeologists can tell, were they buried in a way of keeping up with the tradition of burying in this site that dates back to the
Yeah.
Neolithic period, or what's
Yeah.
the background on this?
No, that's a good question, an important question, and it brings up all sorts of things. Now, just to give a specific answer first of all. So yeah, these burials were not like the so these are the Neolithic burials at the same site. So when I said about positioning, so these are some Neolithic burials, and these people have been sort of crouched up. They've been squashed together. They're not, we have different terms for different. So I can't remember what these are called. Maybe crouched or more. There's a certain, and then there's we talk about, like in these sheets that I was talking about. We talk about flexed, semi-flexed, fully flexed, and we get different forms of burials just to do with the positioning of the body. So, and at Tel Karasa, I should say, the people who are excavating the site, they excavated it, and they actually thought that these Muslim burials, they thought they were Neolithic at first. They didn't really, because they weren't experts. These were experts on very ancient archaeology, and they didn't really think that they knew they're different. They knew they're different, but strangely enough, the reason they excavated them and they did so much analysis on them, which you might mention, the reason they did that is because they thought they're Neolithic and they wanted to find out about Neolithic people, but actually they weren't. And then when they showed them to people, and I was one of the people they showed them to, it became very obvious from the way they laid out that these were Muslim burials. And then, but because they're Muslim, it means they're a lot younger in date. They weren't as old, and so DNA and all sorts of things survived much better. And they're also able to do radiocarbon dating as well, C14 dating. And so yeah, they're from the Muslim period, and so they definitely differ quite a lot. So, but just the other point, which is why were they buried there? I suppose the simple thing is we don't know. Simple answer. But I think two things. One thing is I think with Islamic burials and actually with a lot of burials, but particularly with Muslim burials, people generally get buried quite quickly after they die, and that's kind of quite important. And you get that in Jewish tradition as well. And I think it's probably a good idea, especially in a hotter climate, so to bury people quickly. So it's quite possible that these two people died and they're just buried. But was this site was kind of a feature in the landscape, and so I think the real reason in this case is that it was a feature, it's a mound in the landscape, and so it's a place. You also kind of, and this is probably universal, or it's quite important, a lot of both. You want to know where people are buried, and this because you don't want to do, for example, farming where people are buried. You don't want to do ploughing, and you want to know where they are. So from just a purely practical point of view, you want to know, oh, well, this area is marked out. And that's one of the important, that's why people have gravestones a lot, one of the reasons. And then there's the other reason is that if they're buried in an identifiable location, it's somewhere where you as a relative, friend, whatever, if you want to come and visit their site, now whether that's but if you just want to remember where they're buried, if you want to know, then you can identify the spot. And also just even kind of legally, it might be quite important, because if you want to say that somebody's died, well, we'll say, well, how do you know they've died? Well, then you can say, well, they're buried in that specific place. So there's kind of that element of it as well. So, but the final element to that is the idea that maybe there's also a thing with burial that that it's maybe, and I've thought of this, maybe it's also a way of kind of understanding the past as well. That so you do get, sometimes you get burials in old buildings, things like that. So maybe the antiquity of a place gives it some kind of status, but that's kind of another big issue as well.
Yeah, it was interesting to read that with a lot of Bedouin Arabs, they would bury their dead in ruins.
Yeah.
I find that interesting because a lot of Arabic poetry, early Arabic or pre-Islamic poetry, talks about ruins. And so, yeah, I just wonder if there's some type of correlation between the idealized talk of ruins in poetry, so to speak, and the burial of Bedouins, their dead in ruined places.
Yeah, I think that is kind of definitely a thing, because it's more than I'd say the times it happens is more than kind of coincidence, and yeah, this is interesting. So and I suppose here we're talking mostly about the Near East. I mean, but you get in the Middle East, you get for early periods, and it happens in Islamic periods as well. You get oftentimes people live in the same area. You get villages, and the village people live in a village which is kind of on its own, and then the houses fall down, maybe because they're made of mud brick or something, or even if they're stone, they fall down, and then they're rebuilt. And so gradually the village or the settlement gets higher than the surrounding area. And these, within archaeology, we call them tells, hills. And so these are settlement mounds, basically places where people have lived in the same place for sometimes thousands of years, millennia. And there's lots of examples. Iraq's got lots. So yeah, the idea that that you bury people in these sites. And so lots of the excavations of ancient sites, like say people interested in Neolithic or what other things, Babylonian, Assyrian, all these pre-Islamic cultures, pre-classical cultures, with there's tell sites, and even classical sites. All these sites around the region, you'll usually find there's quite often a Muslim cemetery on the top, which a lot of the archaeologists are interested in earlier periods. They find it difficult because it means that they can't excavate these areas sometimes. But yeah, that's quite a significant feature in many sites.
And if we can just shift our focus for a second, and I was wondering if you have any slides on the graves or the burials found in Nimes, France. I did want to ask some questions about those. I guess first, what do the Muslim graves in Nimes reveal about the presence and integration of Muslim communities in medieval France? And how does this discovery challenge or confirm previous understandings of Muslim migrations and settlements in Europe? Kind of just to talk about
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. So Nîmes. Yeah. So where is it? It's in France, southern France. Oh yeah, I was just looking for it on the map. I couldn't quite find it, but it's so in this green zone. Can you see, if you can see the screen? There's this green zone. It's just on the right of that Nîmes. And Nîmes is I say it's a Roman city. It was a Roman city, and it's quite an important Roman city. And it's got a triumphal arch, Roman triumphal arch, and there's a lot of Roman ruins there that are quite well preserved. And yeah, so it was and as people probably know, the Arabs invaded Spain and went further north during the Umayyad period, and you can see again on this map the Battle of Poitiers, which is one of the, like, kind of when the Arabs basically turned back from France, deciding possibly it wasn't the right place for them, too wet. They didn't like the climate, whatever. But yeah, Nîmes is in the south of France, and I think the interesting thing is they found during excavation works, again, this idea of development archaeology, where you're building new buildings. And so I think this is for a road. They found some burials, and these are the 3 burials they found. Hang on, sorry. Yeah. The 3 burials they found. So this is 3 males. I think, and on the slide you can see kind of the dates, the estimates of the dates. So one was about 30 years old, one was 20 to 29 years old, the other was 50 years old. You can also see here on the dates. So the dates are quite early. These are done by C14 dating. The one is between 684 and 761. So, yeah, quite early. So what you could say, if you take like a midpoint for these dates, they're all around about 700, 690. So they're quite early burials. But I don't know if I've got in the next picture. No, I haven't. But what's remarkable about, maybe in this one, I can't see. What's remarkable about the burials is they're buried outside this city, but that these burials were buried amongst Christians. So there's a cemetery there which also had Christians, and the majority of the burials were Christians. So the question is who were these people? Why were they buried in a Muslim style?
And were there evidence of them dying by trauma, fighting, even disease? Do we know how?
Yeah. Okay. Well, what? Even though none of them died through fighting, I can't remember the exact cause of death, but they all showed traces of having been involved in battles. So I think so. The assumption is that the working hypothesis is that these people were soldiers, possibly fighting with the and the date, depending on the date, these could have been fighting within a state, an area which was both Christian and Muslim. So this is actually kind of a state which was neither particularly one nor the other, maybe nominally Christian, but certainly didn't see being Muslim as being a barrier to being part of that society. And that's what's very interesting. So this is kind of at a very early stage. So maybe these people came as mercenaries, maybe they were part of the society, but they also did DNA analysis of these people, and this is just a kind of an analysis of kind of where the genes for these people came from. But the general, this is quite technical, but the general feeling, this is kind of like a heat map, is that these people came probably ancestrally they're from northern Africa, but not necessarily their immediate ancestors. So that's kind of quite interesting. They were, but then what's interesting is if you compare that to also some of the Christians also in Spain. Well, I'm talking about Spain rather than France now. Were probably of North African origin. So you get this kind of yeah.
Do we see a difference between how Christian in this very region, since they were buried next to Christians as well. Do we see a difference in how Christians were buried versus how they were buried, or are there similarities between the two?
Well, there's similarities in the fact that they're both Christians and Muslims are fully flexed. They're fully laid out, but the Muslims are usually buried on their side, particularly at this early stage. And so you can see, particularly, I think in the middle one shows it quite well, is often the graves are very narrow, so they can only really lie on their sides. I mean, there are different forms, there are different traditional forms of Muslim burials. Sometimes they actually dig down and they're buried in a niche on the side. But in this case, and this is quite typical, they're often just laid on their side and kind of propped up to remain in that sideways position. So they're kind of facing Mecca, whereas the Christians were laid just generally on their backs with their arms down, just sometimes crossed, but that's like in a very but certainly never on their sides. Just to come back to a question which you asked earlier on, because I think it's probably worth saying about the differentiation between male and female burials, is as far as I know, apart from the occasional piece of jewelry, I don't think there is any differentiation that I've kind of noticed. I mean, there may be, statistically, there may be, but I haven't seen any. So as far as I know, women were buried in exactly the same way. The one thing that is kind of quite strong, is quite definite, is the idea of individual graves, which in Christianity was not always the case. So with Muslim graves, unless you get like a plague pit or like a battle or something like that, in general, Muslims are buried in a single grave on their own.
And we really only have a couple more questions. A lot of them
Yes.
answered. A lot of the questions we had, you answered them as you were speaking. So that was a great way of kind of blending in your presentation and the questions that we have written down. And then a lot of them were, I don't know, after a while kind of would have seemed repetitive, because we were trying to find if there were any kind of variations in how Muslims were buried across time and region. But, you've consistently or constantly mentioned that, you really don't see any difference across time and region in how Muslims were buried.
Yeah.
And it's maybe some certain variations that might be due to wartime situations.
Yeah.
Disease epidemics and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, okay, so what happens below ground, there's not much variation, but what happens above ground, there's quite a lot of variation in terms of, so these are the actual burials, but in terms of the monuments or the marking of the graves, there's quite a huge difference, and it's you get it in so you get for example, I'll just some like, say Najaf in Iraq. At Najaf, you get there something like a city of the dead, where you get things like almost houses built around where people are buried. I think that's kind of one thing. And then you get, and this is kind of I know sort of in terms of religious, theologically, it's kind of a thing that people, there's a whole question of the Muslim like built tomb, where you have like a monumental structure built around a grave. And sometimes you get this with holy men, sometimes you get it with just people who are famous, like sultans, people like that. So I mean that just to go back to this very early example we had from where is it? Yeah, from Samara. I mean, there's a discussion about whether this building was actually built as a tomb, or whether it's built for some other reason and the tombs are secondary. There's arguments for both. but certainly later on in Islamic society, you get lots and lots of tombs being built, monumental tombs, often covered with domes. And
Taj
as I say,
Mahal
these,
being a good example.
yeah, Taj Mahal being a good example, yeah. And you get everything in between. So fairly recently, last year, I had the opportunity to visit Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia, and there they had lots of there's a large cemetery, but the stones, the cemeteries, and I think it was a pilgrim cemetery, but the graves were simply marked with big stones, just big stones, no writing. We did have one inscription on a stone, but out of, let's say, I think we had about 300-400 graves. Most of them were just big round stones from the wadi, just used. And so I think you get so from very simple to very complex. And you say, as you say, the Taj Mahal, and you've got the tomb of Sultan Sanjar in Merv, and you got all these magnificent things, but kind of everything in between.
And so I wonder if, like, what looking into the grave can kind of tell us about the person, their identity, religious beliefs, and whatnot. I mean, and maybe this might be a segue to a separate podcast in the future.
Yeah.
Do tombs also kind of give us a story of similar to what we could find out looking into the grave if we look on top, or are those things a little bit harder to kind of figure out because you can make all kind of different elaborations for?
Yeah, no, very interesting, and because of my interest in, like, let's call it funerary archaeology, because of my interest in this, something I've been quite so at its most basic, I'd say you could get two types of memorial, let's say, to a person's. Yeah, you can get very elaborate ones, and you can get okay. So there's those. Yeah, I know what I was going to say. Those which have epigraphic. So they have writing on them. They have writing saying the name of, not even necessarily saying the name of the person, but just saying something. And that, of course, that helps you because it's often religious, and so you know that this is help from above, without excavating the grave. This is a Muslim tomb. We also have many what we call unepigraphic cemeteries, and this can be for I mean, there can be like the place I was talking about in Al-Ula, most of them were unepigraphic. And we also had this in Qatar as well. And we kind of developed a methodology for studying these big cemeteries, which we know we can infer from other information. We're quite early. But there's ways of studying them, like in terms of orientation. So there's lots of kind of information you can get from the surface, and then obviously the more elaborate so then if you go to like tombstones, what's actually a proper tombstone, what's written on the tombstone, and then also you get quite frequently, and we even had this in the you can also have a thing which occurs quite often, which is like water jugs. This is a cup of water jugs, and there's the idea of and this we're going into, like, let's say medieval tradition, Muslim tradition, the idea that there's these two angels which prepare people for the afterlife, and there's also this idea of thirst, that you're going to get very thirsty, so you're going to need something to drink. So you get it was famous. Well, it's not that famous, but it's a published example from Oman, for example, where there's lots of broken water jars all over the cemetery, and the idea is these were to pour water into the grave to kind of keep the people. And this is, I mean, I think this is possibly, in this case, it's probably like a traditional thing, and it's probably to do with the idea of caring for people. And in a desert society, caring maybe just the idea of kind of supplying water. Although we're not quite sure, it could also be that people visiting the grave were drinking water. But anyway, there's certainly the idea of water is kind of a very big thing. And then the other interesting thing is that relating to what's above ground is this idea of how sometimes you get buildings reused and created into a tomb. So in Palestine, there's two famous examples. Well, famous to me, probably not to most people, but there's one. There's a Roman family tomb, which looks like a Roman building, and it's still standing. But I think the Roman tomb was looted a long time ago, pre-Islamic times, and yet a grave was placed within there, a Muslim grave, and that's got an inscription. So we know there's a grave in there, and that was used as that was sort of like a local sacred place for Muslims. And then we've also got this really strange structure at a place called, Roman name was Emmaus, which also features in the Bible. But there we've got a Roman bathhouse, which is adapted and remade into a Roman tomb of a general who was kind of associated with being there. So yeah, there's a lot of things about the actual superstructures about, and then there's of course something I mentioned earlier is about a way of actually kind of, were these ways of understanding the past? Because we in our world now, I suppose we have things like archaeology and we preserve things, but there's different ways of understanding what the past was and stories. So maybe these are partly ways of preserving ancient structures, but also giving illustrations of stories of the past. So yeah. Definitely.
All right. And this right here is our last question.
Yeah.
For your time, and thank you for the presentation. A lot of the pictures were fascinating, and I found them extremely interesting when we were doing the research for this podcast. Looking forward, what are your hopes for what mortuary archaeology might reveal about early Muslim societies? What technological advances could enhance this research, and what ethical practices should archaeologists adopt for respectful study?
Okay, good. Yeah, they're all really good, and I think I'd say in terms of sort of, I'd say I think it's, first of all, I think well, let's deal with the respect side of it first, because I think that's very important. I'd say mortuary archaeology should always be carried out with respect, and I think that certainly applies with Muslims as well, Islamic societies. So I'd say that, and I'd say the presumption should be reburial, and in an appropriate manner where what kind of, and I'd also say as well is that as I think it would be good, actually. Yeah, this is good. It's very good you brought this up. I think it would actually be good to develop some sort of protocol for the excavation and study of Muslim burials, simply because it happens. It does have to happen. It happens because occasionally you do get these cemeteries encountered, and you don't know that they're there. You find them, and so you will have to move them sometimes. So there should be like protocols for doing this. And it should be something that should be discussed with archaeologists. And I'd strongly advocate for, okay, you do the excavation respectfully and you do reburial. But in the meantime, I think there should also be place for study analysis, because I'd say for the society as a whole, or the societies as a whole, I'd say it's important that Muslims know as much about their past historically and kind of analytically, real information, which is kind of scientifically based, because it's the truth basically, in my view. Because as going back to the earlier points, this forensic idea. So I think there should be an opportunity to study this material, to study the human remains, to get what information you can, and also because I think the message that you get out of that is only going to be positive about Muslim society. I mean, one of the things that I feel is important is that as a society, culture, religion globally, I think Islam is perhaps because it's more recent than the other two big monotheistic religions, or three, I don't know, Hindus, but I think it's important that we kind of do understand more about it, because it shows, again, like we've said, there's something quite remarkable about the fact that Muslim burial practices are adopted very early over a big area. That's good. And also, the more we know, the more I think we can say that it can only be positive for understanding the society, and positive for Muslims to know about this as well, and also feel that there's a kind of a depth and a real strength in this culture. That's what I'd say.
All right.
Is there anything that we can do specifically to like overcome maybe some of the political difficulties in sort of researching in certain regions? Because one thing that I've noticed in terms of the discussion we just had is that a lot of these burial sites are located in non-Muslim countries. Is there anything we can do to sort of overcome the difficulties in excavating sites in Muslim countries?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think one thing is, well, actually that's why this is quite a good opportunity just to really advocate for the value in doing this type of archaeology, and the value, and also I'd say kind of that archaeology can be done respectfully, and also that I think as archaeologists, we're also quite good at, let's say you have graves that aren't marked for whatever reason, because the markers have disappeared or whatever. Archaeologists are quite good at identifying whether something is Muslim or not. And so, for example, so I think as a profession, there's I think that there's some kind of meeting that's needed, or conversation there, really, to say that this is something that's positive in these countries, in the region. It's a positive thing, and it's something which and it does things like, it shows that the depth of belief that people have had for a long time in a particular area, and I think that's good. So I think it can only and from my experience and from my research, which is not everything, but I have tried to look at quite a lot of material, is in the general picture that emerges is something that is I'd say good for Muslims to know about, and non-Muslims actually. So I think I'd say it's something that's worth doing. And again, obviously I'm not a religious person, scholar, or anything like that, but I'd say I can't, from what I can see, that there doesn't seem to be any fundamental religious kind of objection to doing this. I mean, obviously it wasn't anticipated when these kind of things came into the, but I think it's important that Muslims' awareness of their culture and their society is as good as any other societies. I suppose that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Especially employing the scientific methods that have been developed in order to study these remains. I mean, if it would be something phenomenal to see a genetic history also a part of, say, like the history of the Umayyad Empire. When they went into Spain or something, if we also had a genetic history of their migration. I understand that they did a genetic history of the Middle East and the Levant for the Crusader period, and they were able to see that some of the bodies buried there had European origins, were mixed either with European or the local population, or were strictly, and then also we're able to find that this admixture or genetics diluted over a period of time. To have that kind of information a part of the history of the Crusades would just be like mind-blowing.
Yeah, I think so, and I'd say it's probably even like kind of politically, in the small sense, political, but politically important, because it shows that like that I think one of the many like kind of political problems in the region, in the Middle East, say, is this idea that people are kind of like completely hermetically sealed from each other, have nothing to do with each other, and it kind of totally ignores the idea that people in the past will have converted from one religion to the other, and people will have intermarried and all these things. And yeah, understanding that would be good.
And then migration for various reasons. From what I understand, in the Arabian Peninsula itself or in the Levant, some bodies that they excavated and did a DNA analysis happened to find out that they were Turkmen.
Yeah.
You know, from Central Asia all the
Yeah.
way. So yeah,
yeah, exactly. And I'll just say one of my pet things that I'm interested in is we know, for example, we know that there were slaves brought from Central Europe into the Caliphate, into Iraq. Again, all of these things would be good to look at.
Right. All right. And again, thank you, Professor Petersen. I think I like to say you hold the top spot as a guest who we've hosted the most so far, with 3 times. And yeah, this was a really exciting episode. And we hope this conversation has brought some valuable insights into the world of Muslim burial archaeology. And for our subscribers or for our audience, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking discussions. And until next time, peace, everyone. And thank you, Professor Petersen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye. Bye. Nice to talk to you.